So great. Ooh, whoops, it's 7 o'clock. Okay.
Okay, here we go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We'll get started in just a few minutes. I'm here with Jane O'Neill. She's going to be presenting tonight's program. Good numbers so far. Great. Thank you. If you have any questions for Jane during the course of the program, please submit those to the chat. Or you can use the Q&A module if you want to. I or Jane will be able to, I will moderate, but Jane will be able to answer those after the presentation is over. I do have a couple of program announcements before we get started, just to give some time for people to join the program. On Wednesday, we have a virtual cooking class with Liz Barber. Liz Barber is going to conduct a virtual cooking class on holiday pies, just in time for all of that cooking you have to do next week. And then we also have a presentation from the Museum of Bad Art. Total opposite to Jane's presentations, but they will be presenting the Museum of Bad Art 101. So it collects and exhibits and celebrates art that will be seen in no other venue. They interpret the art, compare it to classic art, and then share the adventure of building MOBA to a worldwide phenomenon. This is art too bad to be ignored, and so much of it is. It's crazy, but it's folk art, so it's still really important. Oh, great! I'm so glad to see the numbers are increasing. Excellent. So I will just briefly introduce tonight's speaker. If you don't know already, tonight is Jane holds a master's degree in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She is a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Courier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Courier Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program on the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. I do want to mention that her organization, Culturally Curious's mission is to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated art experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as an appreciation for our shared humanity. Tonight, she will present Sacred Symbols and Devilish Details, Northern Renaissance painting from Kempin to Bosch. Artists of the Northern Renaissance use single hair brushes to capture astonishingly tiny details in their paintings. Explore these awe-inspiring additions and their symbolic significance in high resolution and decode the meaning of religious and secular works from the period. And I just want to say that my colleague, Jeff, struggled to find a Bosch painting that did not involve nudity to advertise this program. So hopefully everyone appreciated that. But yeah, these painters are fascinating. So go ahead, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. And spoiler alert, there will be some nudity with those Bosch paintings tonight. Also, that Museum of Bad Art program sounds amazing. I think I might have to sign up for that one.
Awesome. I hope you do. I hope you do.
It would be a lot of fun. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is the debut of this program, and I think I have packed way too much content into this. So thank you for being my guinea pigs. We'll have a lot of fun looking at some of the most remarkable paintings that were executed in the 1400s. So there's a lot to see, there's a lot to dissect. So we're going to dive right in. Of course, we've got this gorgeous image on the screen, which is familiar to a lot of people. It's there's a ton of cultural references to this picture out there, and we'll be spending some time with it shortly and going through all of the symbolism related to it. But let's get started with how we're going to spend the next hour together. So we are going to get started with an introduction to the early Northern Renaissance, very specific time period and place, but we're just talking about the 1400s, basically, in Europe outside of Italy. And then basically 3 categories after this: sacred symbols, devilish details, and the legacy, what happens after the 1400s. I have this image on the screen. This is a Bosch that doesn't involve any nudity here, but I thought it was a great place to get started. It's a picture called The Conjurer. So it's somebody who's basically like swindling the crowd with a ball and a cup game. And so you can see this one figure who's leaning in forward. He's just absolutely mesmerized by what's happening because this conjurer is holding up a single ball. I think it's actually supposed to be a single pearl. We can kind of zoom in there for a moment. And I think this is kind of the sensation one has when they're looking at these pictures tonight. So hopefully nobody will be pickpocketing you as you dive into these images. This is going to be a lot of fun. All right, so let's get started with our introduction to the early Northern Renaissance. So when we're thinking about artists from this period and from this general geography, a couple of important things to keep in mind is that they're coming out of different traditions, different artistic traditions, which inform their practice as painters. So one of those artistic traditions is medieval manuscript illumination, essentially the people who drew the pictures that went into medieval books. So this is an example of a contemporary illuminated manuscript, something that was done contemporary to some of the artists that we'll be looking at, but it's within the same style. And what we see here are, of course, these bright saturated colors, a lot of detail, and this dense kind of foliage and patterning. We'll be seeing a lot of that tonight as well. The other important artistic tradition that informs a lot of early Northern Renaissance artists was stained glass windows. And this is an example of a stained glass window from Chartres Cathedral, which dates to about the mid-1200s. So in an image like this, we see, of course, again, these gorgeous jewel tone colors that just, just grab your eye. And then a lot of minute detail here as well. Even though these windows were huge and there were so many of them, there was a lot of little details that went into this work. So you have this whole tradition kind of already built into the population of appreciating the things that are small. All right, so things begin to change right around the year 1400. And part of that change comes about from the thinking of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, he did not live in the 1400s, he lived in the 1200s, but he had some kind of revolutionary thoughts for the period that had a huge influence on the artists. This is an example, this is a portrait of a posthumous portrait of St. Thomas Aquinas as this thinker and leader of the church. And one of his big ideas that he helped to sort of spread and that really influenced the painters from this time period was this notion that God created all things. And so all things on earth are imbued with some facet, some part of God in them. So literally everyday items would be sacred in some way. That's a really important concept. So instead of using symbolism that was really obvious, even if we just go back to the slide that we were just looking at, obvious symbolism like the Holy Ghost being a white dove that's flying towards the Virgin Mary, that's obvious symbolism. But the way St. Thomas Aquinas's thinking sort of influenced these artists was that you could use symbolism, they called it disguised symbolism, to refer to God or something that is holy by using everyday objects. So we'll be looking at a lot of that tonight. The other way that this is kind of seen in early Northern Renaissance painting is if everything is sacred, then these artists begin to pay attention to literally everything. And they record and document everything in their paintings in a remarkable way. So this is an example of Jan Van Ike. He's a painter from this period. His picture called The Madonna and the Chancellor Roland from 1435. This is in the Louvre Museum. I apologize because it's hard to find a really good reproduction of this work, but we're going to zoom in on some of the details because this notion of recording everything brings us to this idea that when you're looking at these works, they are microscopic and telescopic. So I want to show you some of the microscopic details. Of course, we're looking at this chancellor who is anachronistically looking at the Virgin Mary with the infant Jesus on her lap, and Mary's being crowned by an angel. So let's just zoom in on Mary and that angel. I should mention that this painting that we're looking at is only about 2 feet by 2 feet. So the details here are really minute, but you can see the wonderful details of the angel's hair, of the crown here, of the angel's wings, even Mary's face. They're really stunning details. If we zoom back out for a moment, one other microscopic detail I want to share with you is some of the architectural detailing over here, these column capitals. We'll zoom in and we can see that there are whole stories unfolding in these column capitals, stories from the Bible, like the expulsion, the drunkenness of Noah over here that also kind of overlap with the 7 deadly sins. So there's a lot at play here. So we have this notion of the microscopic, looking at all of these details. You'd want to go into the Louvre with a magnifying glass to see them. Well, there's also this notion of the telescopic. So that means it's like you're seeing way far out, great distances here. Jan Van Ike could have situated this whole scene in an enclosed room, but he has opened up this back wall into this incredible view. And I want to kind of zoom in on this view for you so you can see just how far he is documenting and the incredible detail he uses with it. So beyond the Chancellor, beyond the Virgin and the Christ child here, we see a whole entire city. We see an island in the middle of this river, this incredible bridge. This sort of untouched, untamed nature in the background, and then these remarkable mountains off in the distance. They sort of have this atmospheric perspective to them. So this picture has the microscopic and has the telescopic in it. And as you spend more and more time with it, it's really kind of awe-inspiring, remarkable. Now, another big characteristic, important characteristic of this time period and this place is the idea of an altarpiece. Usually what we're going to be looking at are called triptychs, the altarpieces in 3 parts. So altarpieces sort of function like windows with shutters. They have 2 wings on them that are usually on hinges so that they can open and close like the shutters of a window. So right now we're looking at an altarpiece that has its wings closed like this. And typically early Northern Renaissance artists would paint a picture on the exterior of those wings. And it was painted usually in gray tones. This is called grisaille. And in this case, and in many other cases, these gray tone pictures are meant to look like little sculptural niches. So this, this box, this 3-dimensional box that is the altarpiece almost looks like it has more depth to it because of this. So in this case, we're looking at, of course, another depiction of the Virgin Mary and the angel Gabriel announcing that she's divinely pregnant. We'll see a couple of those tonight. So if we open up this particular altarpiece that's in the collection of the Prado Museum in Madrid, we can see that all of a sudden it's color, all of a sudden we have the microscopic and the telescopic here. So how do you read something like this? And of course you can see the hinges here as well. And a lot of these altarpieces are meant to sort of sit in a 3-dimensional space, not absolutely flat up against a wall, especially when they're smaller like this and sort of intended for individual devotion. So whenever you're looking at an altarpiece like this, the central panel is always the most important, but oftentimes you can read the entire story from left to right, which is kind of interesting. So this is a story on the life of Christ. It begins over here in this Gothic style cathedral where Christ is getting circumcised. And then the big story, the big show here is the crucifixion at the top center in the central panel. And then over here, we see he's been crucified but taken down off the cross, and he is about to be entombed. So we get a sense of this remarkable detail of the microscopic, of the telescopic, how these altarpieces work. I just want to show you one kind of outlier, interesting outlier in terms of how altarpieces are put together. And it's a local one. This one is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and it has always just stayed with me. This is another relatively small triptych, a 3-part altarpiece that opens up like this. And in this case, we're seeing the martyrdom of a saint who was actually drawn and quartered. And instead of having 3 separate stories here, the artist has done something that I think is really creative. He's used the width of these 3 panels together to emphasize how this particular saint, whose name was Hippolytus, how he was being drawn and pulled apart in this incredibly tense moment. Now, of course, the most famous altarpiece of all time, we've talked a lot about recently, so I'm not going to spend really any time on it tonight, but I do have to just acknowledge that the Ghent Altarpiece is just this really incredible early Northern Renaissance example of painting, and it is an altarpiece as well. Here we see the closed Ghent Altarpiece. Here we see it opening up over on the right. We see a couple of those grisaille painted sculptures on the exterior. And when you open it up, it's all Technicolor, and it is all meant to dazzle the eye. At the top center, of course, is a depiction of not Jesus, but God the Father. And I love this image. This image is going to take us into another big idea, one last primary concept for the early Northern Renaissance, and that is oil painting and kind of the detail and the shimmer that you can get from oil painting. So as we're looking at this very bedazzled depiction of God, and we zoom in here, we can see what it means when we talk about these artists using a single hair on their brushes. And I should mention too that the Ghent Altarpiece was painted by Jan Van Ike and his brother in the early 1430s. So we see individual hairs on God's head, in his beard. My eye always goes to, I think there's just like one white hair over here, and it just adds this kind of layer of interest in this for me. And of course, there's all these pearls and gemstones that just seem to shimmer and shine here. And that is the last important characteristic of the early Northern Renaissance that I wanted to emphasize to you. And that is oil paint versus tempera paint or fresco style painting. Oil painting has this incredible glossy finish to it that really sets these images apart in so many ways. So I wanted to share with you one last comparison here. On the left, we have an image by an artist named Petrus Christus, and this is his depiction of a goldsmith in his shop. It's from 1449, and this is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. On the right over here, we have a depiction by somebody outside of the Northern Europe, but who was working at the same time. This is Piero della Francesca, his depiction of the Resurrection from 1460, and so this is down in Italy. And I think this comparison, you can really see the difference between oil painting over here on the left and fresco style painting over here on the right. Oil painting, we can really accomplish those saturated colors, those same colors that they loved in illuminated manuscripts, in stained glass windows, and we can also get that incredible shine. Look at these vessels in the background and how you get the sense that you're looking at the reflection of light coming through a window, maybe even behind where we're standing. And we're in a goldsmith's shop, so everything sort of has this remarkable shine to it. The artist is focusing in on the specifics all throughout this picture, and even includes this this fabric coming over the edge of the goldsmith's table here so that it feels like it's coming into our space. There's so much here that's designed to make it feel very intimate, like we are a part of this space. Everything with this fresco, though, is about really more about the anatomy and about the monumentality of the resurrected Christ here. I mean, notice how fit Jesus is here. He's got like a 4-pack, and even the sleeping soldiers that were guarding the tomb, even their anatomy is emphasized in this image about Christ's resurrection. He's standing here with a flag. He looks heroic. The details of the landscape behind him are just not important. It's all about the figure here. So we can see, and also very importantly, the details aren't there and the saturated colors really aren't there as well. So we are going to dive in to the eye candy that we see over here on the left. And so we're going to start off with these sacred symbols, and we're going to be looking at some of the best known examples, and hopefully I can share with you some of the interesting interpretations that maybe you didn't hear about when you were back in college as an undergrad. Okay, so the first and one of the best known examples from this time period is the Merode Altarpiece. This is generally accepted to be a painting by an artist named Kempen, and sometimes it's referred to as the Annunciation Altarpiece. This is a work that was created right around 1427, and this is in the Metropolitan Museum at the Cloisters Museum. So this is something that is a short trip away if you ever wanted to see it. It's the central panel is roughly 2 feet by 2 feet. So this is something that was created for private devotion, not necessarily a church. And you can imagine almost closing up the wings to this altarpiece and moving it from room to room. It's something that's kind of on an intimate scale. So let's take a look at, let's kind of zoom in here and see what's going on. We've got our 3 images here when the altarpiece is open. And on the right, we have these 2 kneeling figures who are approaching this open door with these steps leading into a contemporary townhouse space, contemporary to the life of the artist who was living in the 1400s. And in this space, we have a biblical scene unfolding, and that is the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel telling Mary, the Virgin Mary, that she is divinely pregnant. We're going to go back to all of this. And then over here on the left is a depiction of Joseph, Mary's soon-to-be husband. So at this point, her fiance, and he's depicted as a much older man at this point. Okay, so let's zoom in on this central panel because we know that the central panel is the most important part. All right, so here it is, beautiful details here. And we're going to be zooming in even a little bit more as we move through this. So one of the important things to understand as we're looking at this work of art is that this central panel was created sort of on spec by the artist. And so it was something that already existed before those hinged pieces came about. And so it was something created to kind of lure in potential clients. And there's a lot here to really sink your teeth into. So we have this notion that this is the moment that Mary has become pregnant. So this is the incarnation, or God taking on human flesh, the form of human flesh, really, for the first time. So this is such an important moment. And the artist here has imbued the scene with all of this symbolism from everyday life. Again, going back to this notion of disguised symbolism. So let's walk our way through this. We've got our angel, we've got Mary, and she's sitting down possibly on the floor or possibly on like the footboard of this long bench. And this refers to her humility, which is very important. I feel like Jess, our librarian, will appreciate the fact that Mary is holding her book with a white cloth underneath this. This is her book of hours. It's a prayer book. And the white cloth is there to keep her very expensive book clean. I bet all librarians wish that we were holding our books this way. So there's a lot going on in the stuff of Mary's house. And this is the stuff where St. Thomas Aquinas would have said God is visible. So let's kind of move through some of this stuff. We will get to this little flying baby in just a moment, but I wanted to draw your eye to this pot that's hanging in the back. Just the remarkable detail over here too, that there's double shadows behind this pot, meaning the artist here is really trying to capture the light coming in from both of these windows. Remarkable attention to detail. Now, the pot and the towel here are references to Mary's cleanliness, her virginity, but the pot is also a reference to a vessel, the very notion of a vessel, and that's what Mary was considered too. So you could probably even imagine that the vase on the table is another reference to Mary as a vessel. So you do have this little baby flying in with the crucifixion, with the cross here. So this is, of course, a reference to the Holy Ghost, or Jesus kind of flying in, and his ultimate demise too. So everything's being referenced here. But even though these artists wanted to focus on what was observable in the natural world, we do have this kind of supernatural element to this picture. This is an unusual way of depicting the Holy Spirit. So some more great details here on the table. We have these white flowers, these white lilies, which are again references to Mary's purity, to her chastity. And we have this candle that has just recently, almost immediately, been extinguished. So an extinguished candle had a number of different ways of being read. Sometimes it's called the breath of God. Sometimes a lit candle is this reference to Jesus himself. So here, if the candle has just been extinguished, the way I always learned it was that this was the moment Mary's purity has gone. And art historians go through have made great efforts to also acknowledge that Van Ike has perfectly captured the way a candle gets snuffed out, like the smoke goes straight up and then it starts kind of zigzagging and folding over itself like this. So a lot of attention to detail. Over here on the table, we have a book and a scroll. This is a reference to the Old and the New Testaments here. The Old Testament would be the scroll. Now, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that the perspective of this table and even this bench where Mary's sitting is sort of off, right? We don't get the sense that this is a logical space that she's in. And it looks as though we're looking at kind of the tabletop that's been pushed up so that we could see everything on its surface. And I just want to contrast this to what's happening in Italy around the same time, where they're working in fresco, and an artist like Masaccio is, familiar with the writings of Brunelleschi, and he has mastered single point perspective. So they are doing something completely different with their artwork. Here, art historians make the case that perhaps some of this wonky perspective that's happening in the Merode Altarpiece is helping us to telescope in to some of these details. So art historians have found symbolism in nearly every facet of this painting. Even the fire screen over here is sometimes the fireplace itself is like a reference to hell. The fire screen is Mary's body, sort of protected from outside influence, or protecting her virginity again. So there's a lot going on here, and multiple readings sometimes of the same object, which would have allowed for a really, I think, fulfilling kind of experience if you were the person who was meditating on this work of art. So if we zoom back out again for a moment, I want to draw our attention to what's going on over here on the left-hand side. So we have these two figures over here on their knees coming to this door. It seems as though if they were to stand up, they'd be way too tall for this door, but that sort of seems true for Mary and this angel here as well. The ceiling seems pretty low for them. And then there's this final third figure out here, out back. So we're going to zoom in on them just for a moment. And what we are looking at here, they're referred to as the donors. They are the people that paid for this picture. In particular, this young man here, we know that he was painted first and his wife was added in a little bit later. So art historians think of this particular picture as almost like it's like a prayer for a fruitful family. When Mary gets pregnant, it's like the hope for their family to also get pregnant. There's a lot of debate as to who this attendant is in the background, but just notice the detail of his costume over here. It's really remarkable. And then he holds open this door, which lets us peek out onto this street scene, again, contemporary to the artist and not when Mary lived. We see people on horseback, shop fronts. There's just an incredible amount of detail over here. And what we're looking at is an enclosed garden. And oftentimes an enclosed garden like this is a reference to Mary's purity. Of course, the door's open here now, and she is now divinely pregnant. We see here roses. Roses are oftentimes associated with Mary. Red roses are oftentimes associated with the sacrifice with blood of Jesus's sacrifice on the cross. There are other details here too in terms of the plant life that I wanted to draw your attention to. Over here by the door, we're just going to zoom in on those plants on the ground in the foreground. Each one of these plants is very carefully selected and included because they refer to different aspects of who Mary was. So in particular, some of the plants in the grasses have been identified as forget-me-nots that are also known as the eyes of Mary, and violets, which are a symbol of Mary's humility. Again, she was sitting on the floor. And then I think that these are strawberries over here, and strawberries are functioned as symbols of a fruitful virgin. So every blade of grass here is serving a purpose. And even notice the nails on the door leave like this trail of rust underneath them. The artist here has not spared any detail. Okay, so we're moving from this panel over to the other side, all the way over to the right side to take a look at Joseph here too. All right, so Joseph in his wood shop. Joseph was a carpenter, if you remember. Outside the window, beyond Joseph's shop here is some really phenomenal detail about everyday life in the 1400s. This is probably kind of an imagined cityscape, but we see people walking about, we see shop fronts. We get a sense in terms of the fact that this was created in a place where fine goods were being created, and that there was a really kind of thriving economy. But in the foreground, we see this older gentleman, this depiction of Joseph hard at work at his bench here. And all these different tools. Art historians spill a lot of ink over what they think these tools are, even what Joseph is engaged in doing here, kind of boring the holes into this wood. One art historian thinks that this is a reference to like the nails being hammered through Christ's hands and feet during the crucifixion. But what he's really making over here is a mousetrap. And there's another mousetrap out here that he is selling. It's out on his table out here so that people could walk by and buy a mousetrap. So what's the significance of that? Well, there's the main thinking around this is related to not St. Thomas Aquinas, but St. Augustine, who talks about Jesus on the cross as being a trap for the devil. And so the mousetrap here sort of symbolically functioning as like a reference to the crucifixion. So like I said, there's a lot loaded into this picture and a lot of different ideas about what these everyday objects might have meant. Now we're going to turn our attention to another artist at this point, and his name is Jan Van Ike. I've already mentioned him a few times. He is essentially considered the undisputed master of the early Northern Renaissance. And we can see him here in this very small portrait, and that other picture that we started with, which we'll be getting to. Here are those same works on that same wall. I just wanted to give you a sense of the scale of this picture that we are about to look at. It's only about 9 inches tall, and there's probably a reason for that. The scale probably helps to inform that this was a self-portrait. So let's zero in on this little self-portrait. Probably our closest look at the artist Jan Van Van Ike here. So this was painted in 1433 and it's at the National Gallery in London. So if you're an artist and you're painting a self-portrait, this is something that you might keep with you to show potential clients that, here's my face, here's my painted face, here's how well I can capture your likeness in a work of art. So it's interesting to think about this penetrating gaze that he has here in this three-quarter profile view as somebody who's looking in a mirror and not necessarily out at us. So one kind of fun thing here too is as I'm putting together the PowerPoint for this program, I have all these grid lines on my PowerPoint slides. And so I can see that, that his mouth is right at the center axis going horizontally, and the edge of his eye is right at the vertical axis here. So these artists were using grids in order to lay out these works, which was really kind of fun and fascinating for me. Now, Van Ike is all about details. So let's zoom in on some of the incredible details of this self-portrait. He is giving us kind of an unflinching, warts and all view of his face. And so we see the crow's feet, we see the red vein in his eye over here, and they hold up so well from a little bit further away. We also see that kind of gleam, the shine in his eye, which once again, artists down in Italy could not have cared less about creating the gleam or the shine in somebody's eye. But when you're working with oil paints, these are like the wonderful details that you can add in. If we move a little bit further down the face, we get to this jaw that is just starting to sag, and we can see this 5 o'clock shadow sprouting out of his jawline here. Again, this wonderful attention to detail. Now, what about the hat, right? For a long time, this was, I was always taught that this was a turban and that this was something that artists wore at this time. And I was always shown depictions of other people who worked in the trades wearing something similar, but this was actually high fashion for the time. And we see Joseph back in the Merode Altarpiece wearing something that's sort of similar. This was called a chaperon. And so it would have had these flaps that go down along the side, and it would have made sense for somebody who's working with their hands to kind of stack it on their head in this way. And it's just sort of artfully stacked, and it's beautifully recorded here. Now, there's a few last details that tell us that this is probably a self-portrait, and it's in the frame. So this is the original frame, and you'll notice that there's an inscription along the top and along the bottom, and that is a painted inscription that is painted to look like it's carved. So even then, he's doing something that fools our eye. So it's so at the bottom, the translation here is Van Ike made me, with a really specific date here. And then at the top, it says, as I can. So those phrases together sort of would imply that this is probably a self-portrait. As I can is also a play on Van Ike's name. Ike and I sounded very similar. And this was also very similar to the way that scribes would sort of finish up a transcription of a religious text. They would write, as I can, not as I would, which was kind of a humble way to say, this is the word of God and not my word. Van Ike drops the as I would, and he says, as I can. There's a lot of ego here. As only I can is the implication here. So there's confidence and there's pride in what he's able to produce here. And we'll see his name sort of proudly displayed again in this next work that we're about to look at. And that is, of course, the Arnolfini double portrait that we see over here. Now, this is, again, still kind of a relatively small work. It is less than 3 feet tall. So we're about to look at the Arnolfini double portrait from 1434 over here. Every time I see this picture, it just knocks my socks off. The colors are so brilliant, and the picture itself is so enigmatic. There's a lot going on here. So traditionally, this has been thought of as a wedding portrait for a number of reasons that we'll get into. Lots of different scholarly debate around that these days. Sometimes this is also considered considered like a legal proceeding where he's like passing rights and responsibilities onto his wife. There's also people that posit that this was painted posthumously after his wife had died. But we do know that this is an Italian businessman who was living in Northern Europe who had this commissioned. And so let's dive into some of the most alluring details here. So I want to draw your attention to what's happening just between this couple, this really sort of enigmatic couple. Actually, before I get to that, I do just want to make a note about what's happening here with her dress and this pose. Every time I showed this to my classes when I was teaching college, everybody would just say, so she's pregnant, right? This is the wedding portrait, but she's pregnant. In fact, this was just the style of dress for the day. She was almost certainly not pregnant. So and it's kind of funny because today we still have styles that sort of mimic that same look of being pregnant. Everybody likes to wear tunics with leggings, and that's kind of pregnancy wear. So back in those days, they would wear something that sort of emphasized a big swollen belly, if only that was the desirable form today too. All right, so now let's draw our attention to this back wall just between the couple. It's almost like a third face in this picture. So we're going to zoom in over here. And what we can see, first of all, is another Van Ike signature. Van Ike was here. It's sort of like beautiful graffiti on that back wall. And then we see just below it, a convex mirror reflecting back the entire room that we were just looking at. And around this mirror are depictions of the Passion of Christ. So his torture and execution, and those little tiny pictures are about half an inch big. That's how small these details are, but we can still figure out what every scene is. And again, notice the shine on each of them. Everything seems to sort of glisten in these pictures, but let's draw our attention to this notion of where we see a reflection back into the room where we're standing here. And I want to make that even bigger for you. This is that reflection. So we can see the back of Giovanni, we see the back of his wife over here, and then we see two other figures in the room who are presumably standing where we, the viewers, are standing. And you'll notice one of them looks like he's wearing a red chaperone. So that is thought to be a sort of a reference to another self-portrait by Jan Van Ike, that he would include his own self-portrait right under his signature here. It's kind of wonderful. It's kind of brilliant. And we've actually already seen him tonight do this exact same thing when we saw the Roland Madonna before. Guess who's standing right there with the red turban right in the middle of the picture? That is probably a self-portrait by Jan Van Ike included there as well. Okay, so back to the Arnolfini wedding portrait, or double portrait over here. So why do people think that this is a wedding portrait? Well, one of the first things that we see, in addition to just the fact that it's a couple, they seem to be sort of holding hands here. It's an interesting gesture. He's kind of holding the underside of her open hand. But you'll notice that they've taken off their shoes. Here are his wooden clogs. Here are her red shoes over here. So it seems to suggest that this is kind of a sacred space, something important is happening in this room. That was one big reason. In these details too, I just want you to admire the details of their clothing. These little kind of open ruffles on her dress are just astonishing. Other details that seem to kind of refer to marriage or childbirth is the fact that there are all these oranges over here on this bench and on the windowsill over here. These would have been kind of rare and very expensive. And of course, fruit is oftentimes a symbol of fertility. So this was really important at the time. And so over here, we also have on the bedpost a depiction of Saint Margaret, who is the patron saint of childbirth. So there's a lot going on. But one other clear indication that this is about their relationship is that there's a dog, and dogs are symbols of love and fidelity. That's why that name Fido has always stayed with the dog, because it is the word for fidelity. Now, this is a picture that always gets parodied, but one last image I wanted to share of it is this oftentimes reproduced viral image of people at home during COVID who have recreated the Arnolfini double portrait over here. Brilliantly, I should add. It's very well done. So the last sacred symbols that we're going to be looking at tonight are related to the unicorn tapestries that are also in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So these tapestries there's 7 in total, and they are also quite mysterious, but very heavily laden with symbolism and minute detail. So most of them are at least 12 feet high, but they're all kind of different shapes and sizes. So there's some thinking out there that they might not even all be a part of the same series. They come from a castle in France that was like looted during the French Revolution, which included these tapestries that were looted. They were later found in a barn. So the fact that they even exist is quite remarkable. So we're going to work our way through them. But before I move on from this image, just to give you a sense of scale, I want to emphasize too just how valuable these tapestries were. Tapestries were more expensive than castles. It took so much labor, so much work, and so much skill in order to create something like this. It took a full day to weave about 1 square inch of these tapestries. They were probably designed in Paris, and they were probably woven in Belgium. And interestingly, it's mostly men who worked in this trade. So let's move through these tapestries, and I'll give you a sense of the generally accepted story that is involved with these tapestries. I should say we don't know who commissioned them. There's this monogram in each of these tapestries, and some of them, they appear multiple times. It's an A with a backwards E. We don't know who that refers to. There's some debate over this, but what we see here in what is generally considered to be the first tapestry is the hunters of this unicorn entering the woods. So they're dressed up in the fashion of the day. They've got all of these dogs, and then we've got this thick blanket really of all of this highly detailed vegetation. And of course, when it comes to the early Northern Renaissance, every plant has significance here. In this case, most of them are completely accurate to what you would find as you enter the woods over here. And you'll notice that there's a figure who's kind of waving them into the woods, like, come this way. This is where you're going to find the unicorn. Now, I just want to remind you too that this really thick, dense patterning of vegetation is something that comes out of this tradition of illuminated manuscript painting. So one other really kind of interesting fun detail is that these paintings were restored not too long ago. So you can see the backside of them where the colors haven't been faded because they've been exposed to light over the centuries. So you can see that the original colors for these tapestries were as vibrant as what we saw in some of the paintings so far tonight. So we have the hunters entering the woods. Here are the hunters discovering the unicorn. The unicorn's horn here is said to have this kind of magical property of purifying water. So his horn is in the water. He's surrounded by all of these beasts that wouldn't normally kind of get along in real life. So it's this kind of magical kingdom, birds and deer and some things that are kind of unrecognizable here in the foreground. But we have about 12 hunters, and now we have a little bit of sky and a reference to a castle in the background, and they've spotted what they want to hunt. And at this point, maybe you've even spotted a few examples of that monogram again and again here too. So what happens next? They surround that unicorn. A fight is about to ensue. We've got all of these spears. Well, that's the horn here, drawing our attention to this unicorn, and the dogs are kind of surrounding it as well. And then here they begin to attack. And it's a really kind of violent, bloody attack against this unicorn. You can see that the unicorn is essentially goring this dog over here. But all of the detail, the plants, the birds, this is so densely packed, and I'm kind of moving quickly through it, but we can see the unicorn has been sort of wounded, but you can't overcome a unicorn by force, according to legend. Oh, and that's the back so that we can see the really brilliant colors here. According to legend, a unicorn can only be subdued by a virgin. And so what we're looking at here are just remnants of a tapestry, two remnants that existed. And there was a virgin who would have been situated over here, who had sort of tamed this unicorn, who doesn't even notice that there are dogs licking its wounds. And then this other woman is kind of signaling to this hunter who is blowing his horn and drawing attention to all the other hunters that he's captured the unicorn. You'll notice that the maiden and the virgin are in this enclosed garden. Once again, a reference to virginity here. So then what happens? Well, the unicorn comes in twice in this panel, where we see he is being stabbed and now he has died, and his body is being laid over this horse, and his horn has been broken off and then bound to his body with what almost looks like a crown of thorns. So don't be surprised that there's a lot of scholars that think that there's religious overtones to this, and his body's being brought forth to this castle and to this particular significant couple over here. So then that brings us to the last and the most famous of these tapestries, and that is the unicorn captive. So we don't even know specifically if this is part of the same cycle, the same series. It's a different size, but it has those same monogrammed initials in them. Perhaps the monograms are from the workshop that created this, but we tend to think that it's it's a reference to whoever commissioned these works. So why do people think that this is about Jesus? Well, in this case, the unicorn is alive again. He has been resurrected. But there's plenty of scholars that think that this is really about, well, this particular image is about something sort of separate. It's about the beloved who has kind of decided to stay with someone. There's a very delicate gold chain that is connecting the unicorn to this tree here. And he's in this tiny little fenced in area where he could easily jump out. So it's this notion of being tamed by somebody's love and being almost content and happy in that position. Once again, we have an image that is completely just jam-packed with foliage. I think there's over 100 species here. They've been able to identify something like more than 80 of the different kinds of plants that are in this particular picture. Some art historians think that that these what look like little trickles of blood here aren't even blood, that it is instead a reference to the pomegranate tree that the unicorn is tied to. So this would be the juice of the pomegranates. But here again, we can see all of these, all the lovely attention paid to these plants over here. And it reminds me of those illuminated manuscripts. And the more time you spend with it, the more you begin to see things like the dragonfly over here and the butterfly. I mean, the details here, it's like there's just such a great payoff for the careful looking. So this notion that this is about romantic love or courtly love here, there's one other tiny detail that supports that, and that is just outside of the fence over here, there's a tiny little frog, and it's a specific kind of frog that medieval writers oftentimes cited for its very noisy mating. So that might be another reference to the courtly love interpretation of this particular tapestry. So we've got this great sense that that when it comes to these symbols, the details are just really remarkable. We're going to spend our last bit of time together looking at devilish details now, references to the devil, references to danger and to hell, really. So I do want to preface this with just the quick preamble that there really throughout the history of Christian art, there's been no fixed one definition of what the devil looks like, which is kind of fascinating. He didn't even appear in Christian art until maybe the 5th or 6th century. And then he was always kind of in a different form. And we'll see him take multiple forms tonight. Here is an example of the devil and a lot of demons in the Limburg brothers painting Hell from the Très Richer de Duc de Berry, which dates to 1460. So this is part of a small prayer book. Imagine meditating on the scene of hell here, where you have the devil who is crowned as like the prince of hell. He's like part goat, but he doesn't have cloven hooves. He's got this kind of different, almost like a griffin's type of foot here. And he's on this pyre, almost like a funeral pyre that is crowded with all of these naked people. And these demons around here are literally adding fuel to the fire, pumping air in to fuel this fire. And the devil is like spitting out more of these tiny naked people. We imagine that hell is the torture from these demons. Some of them have wings and horns. There's even a little bit of farting that's happening over here if you want to get into the full sensory experience of what hell looks like. But I wanted to share with you a really remarkable depiction of hell from Jan Van Ike, our master here. This is a closed altarpiece that we're looking at that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And over here on the left, we see a crucifixion scene, telescopic, microscopic, but over here we have this really interesting depiction of the Last Judgment. So we're going to zoom in on that. This dates to about 1440. At the top of this picture, this long skinny panel of the Last Judgment, we see Jesus. He has come down off the cross. His wounds from the cross are sort of shining and glowing. He's surrounded by angels. We've got almost like a tribunal of saints, and then maybe even some higher ups from the church over here. And then we have this notion of the saved and the damned. And the saved are literally being pulled out of their graves. They're coming out of the water. They're going to be rising up to heaven. And then below that, we have hell. And I think this is Michael the Archangel who's standing over hell. Hell is underground, and it looks as though this giant skeleton with its arms and legs spread wide open is almost like excreting all of these nude bodies down into hell. And they're all kind of writhing in pain, and they're all being attacked by these different demonic beings. And there is so much incredible detail in this picture here. The more time you spend with it, the more payoff there is. We're not just dealing with like the goat horns and the wings here. Everything it sort of shifts as you look at it. But some of these beings have almost like flippers to them, fins, almost like they're underwater creatures. Some of them have huge eyes. Some of them have like tentacles to them. They all have huge teeth that go along with them. Here's the zoomed in view. They are consuming some of these figures. They are wrapping tentacles around them. They're piercing their flesh in all these different ways. This looks absolutely terrifying. And the more you look, the more of these demonic figures you will see. It's really quite impressive. It takes a very creative mind to come up with something like this. So in the last few minutes, I wanted to share with you a couple of works by Hieronymus Bosch, who has the greatest creative mind when it comes to hell and torture. So here is his most famous altarpiece called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And this is that triptych, that altarpiece closed. So we've got this kind of grayscale image of the third day of creation. This is one way to look at it, where we see actually, this is a little tiny depiction of God up here, essentially saying like, this is how I made it. And there's no signs of like animals or plants yet. The earth almost looks like it has this kind of glass globe-like top to it. So you open it up and we have this incredible garden of earthly delights, Technicolor, right? It's a spectacular vision, essentially. So like the other altarpieces that we looked at before, the central panel is really the most important panel, but you can read this from right to left. And this is the Garden of Eden, what is called now the Garden of Earthly Delights. This is what we call it now. We don't really know what it is. This is our modern name for it. And then this is most certainly hell over here on the right. So we'll zoom in a little bit better and we can see this in incredible detail. I want to point out to you that there's a pretty consistent horizon line here from the Garden of Eden to what is happening here in the central panel. These two things are joined, if not sort of one and the same. So over here in the Garden of Eden, we have all of these, like every array of animal you could imagine. We have a giraffe, we have an elephant in the background here, but most importantly, we have God who has created man and has just created woman as well. We can zoom in on that detail over here, and we see all of these fantastic creatures and birds surrounding them and going in and out of the water over here. This almost looks like a little swimming unicorn here in the foreground. So really fantastic creatures. So we have this notion of the creation of man. This is also the creation of sin, and sin is the kind of the unifying theme with the Garden of Earthly Delights. So that brings us to this central panel, which we could really spend an entire hour, if not days and weeks on. There's so much going on here, just different tiers of detail as well. In the foreground, these rather large figures that are about a foot tall. The entire altarpiece is about 12 feet long and about 7 feet high. So these are rather large figures, but they're interacting with fruit and with birds and with fish in sort of lustful scenarios. In the middle ground here, we've got all of these women, nude women. Of course, these are all nude figures, and we've only seen clusters of nude figures like this in hell before, and now they seem to be in this kind of paradise, this extension of the Garden of Eden here, but they are all really up to no good. They're displaying all these 7 deadly sins here. So the men are riding these animals and circling the women back here, and I think I even have a few details, couples canoodling and cavorting throughout. This detail here kind of reminds me of that glass globe that we looked at on the exterior of the altarpiece, and it's been tied to a popular idiom from the time period that roughly translates to this notion of like, happiness and joy is as fragile as a bubble. So this notion that it could pop and disappear at any time. You see a few couples that are encased in little globes like this, and then this is at the far the distance, the far distance in this picture. More nude figures swimming, more mythical beasts as well. Lots of birds. There's eggs over here. There's like what looks like a man-made fountain with a lot of organic material surrounding it too. Everything, of course, looks pretty phallic as well. So let's turn our attention to hell, which is where you really go after you enjoy looking at the Garden of Earthly Delights. And apparently Hieronymus Bosch, our artist here, who painted this right around the year 1500, apparently when he was about 13 years old, he witnessed this horrible fire where about 4,000 homes were razed in this one particular blaze. And so you can almost get the sense that he's captured that in his memory, because he painted this sometime between the age of 40 and 60. And we see the fiery depths of hell kind of in the far distance here, but also these strange compilations of human forms and bones and weapons all coming together in these really disturbing ways. We've got the ears over here that have been pierced together with an arrow. There's a blade coming out of them. There's this so-called tree man. His body almost looks like a cavernous egg. His arms have been transformed into these tree stumps that go down into these boats. And there's this very distinctive face looking out at us that has been generally interpreted to be a self-portrait of the artist. There's so much going on here, but I wanted to draw your attention to what I think are really the most important details here. This is believed to be the depiction of the devil in this picture. The devil has often been painted blue throughout the history of art because that was sort of the way it started. Lucifer was a beautiful fallen angel who was sort of on the dark side, and that was depicted as blue. So in this case, our devil has a bird head, a cauldron on his head, more vessels at his feet. He is eating and excreting human beings. And this particular human being has birds flying out of the rear end as this is happening. Bosch has imagined so many incredible ways of torturing the human body. In this case, there's a figure that's impaled on the strings of a harp. Imagine what it would feel like to have those strings plucked and making music, to have those vibrations going through your body. There's other figures that are impaled on other musical instruments throughout. I want to draw your attention to the fact that there's music that's printed on the rear end of this nude figure here. You can go on YouTube and actually listen to that music. All you have to Google is Bosch butt music, and it comes up, and it is appropriately disturbing. So one last note about the Garden of Earthly Delights. Sometimes this closed panel is interpreted as the final scene. You've seen all the sin, you close the altarpiece, and perhaps this is the great flood kind of washing some of this away. I'll move very quickly just because of time through this next piece, but this is a little bit more Bosch. This is him doing the garden, or not the Garden of Earthly Delights. This is the 7 deadly sins. And so we'll move through these very quickly just to get a sense in terms of how he painted some of these devilish details. This is gluttony over here. We have this man eating, this man drinking, even a child who's kind of begging for more food, sloth, a man who's napping by the fire with his dog. Over here, this is lust, 2 couples canoodling in a tent with the entertainment of these kind of fools over here. Wrath, a woman who is stopping a fight between these 2 men who are both armed. And over here we have envy, the shopkeepers who are looking at this much richer man who even has the ability to pay someone to carry his heavy things. And this is greed, a judge who is taking a bribe while he's hearing a case over here. And that brings us to pride. And pride is a really interesting one because we see this woman from behind and she's admiring herself in a mirror. And look at this little demonic creature that Bosch has included to kind of underscore just how awful a sin pride can be. And he includes these demonic, devilish-like figures in a lot of his paintings. There's one other kind of roundel that's included in this panel where we have the death of a sinner over here, and we have an angel and this devil over here on his bed, kind of almost like weighing his soul as he's about to pass away. This is death who is coming in to pierce his heart and end his life. So Bosch really had a great imagination when it came to these devilish details. So we will wrap up. Oh, this is his depiction of hell. We'll skip over this for now. We'll wrap up with this legacy. And we're going to be looking at the immediate impact of all of this incredible detail, all of this symbolism, and even a little bit of the devil too. So what happens next? We see the 1400s. That brings us to this kind of magical year of 1500, where we reach the High Renaissance. And when I think of the High Renaissance, it's Michelangelo, it's Leonardo da Vinci, like we see over here, it's Raphael, and of course, these are all Italian artists, but they're bringing in big, important ideas and a new kind of thinking. They're bringing in kind of new scientific thinking, an emphasis on philosophy and mathematics that we see over here in Raphael's painting, the School of Athens, where all these great thinkers have been brought together on this one stage. And of course, they're all ushering in this new sense of humanism, this new emphasis on the lives of people, the thinking of people, as opposed to the divine or the supernatural. And that brings us to the greatest artist of the Northern Renaissance, the greatest artist that sort of comes into his own right around 1500. He's not considered an early Northern Renaissance artist. It's Albrecht Dürer. And this is one of his paintings that's not even considered one of his greatest paintings. It's a little watercolor that's called A Great Piece of Turf. And of course, what we're looking at here is a remarkable attention to detail. I mean, a remarkable facility with watercolors too, but we see all of these identifiable plants here, blades of grass, even the roots of some of these things. that show us that he's very carefully observing the natural world here. And it reminds me of that Merode Altarpiece that we started with tonight, where every single plant that is so carefully included has symbolic meaning here, has a reference to something holy, something sacred. And for Durer, that's not really what he's trying to attempt with the great piece of turf. None of this has symbolic or religious meaning per se, but that doesn't mean his artwork doesn't. When he was just 28 years old, he painted this self-portrait. And it's the magical year 1500, right as we're hitting the high Renaissance. And with this portrait, we see that he has inherited essentially the technical ability and the skill to capture the kind of detail that Jan Van Ike had done almost 75 years earlier. Here's the detail of his eyes. Look at the way he captured the gleam of the eyes, the eyebrows here. Every single hair is just remarkable. And even the beard is just painted so beautifully. It's a mesmerizing painting. So here we have that comparison. Jan Van Ike about 75 years earlier, and Albrecht Durer really showing in a beguiling way just what is possible with these highly detailed oil paintings. I just love this posture here too, that elegant hand that's kind of fingering this fur collar that he has here. So he's draining the kind of sacred symbolism from the great piece of turf, but he's kind of imbuing it in his own self-portrait, because he's not looking at us in a three-quarter profile view. He's looking at us straight on. And that would certainly remind anybody of, you know, the depictions of God and Jesus that we've seen throughout the history of art, even in the Ghent Altarpiece tonight. So certainly these high Renaissance artists do have something kind of sacred and supernatural in their abilities here. And we see this amazing shift as we get into the high Renaissance. So I will leave you tonight with the Conjurer once again. I hope you've had the experience of this man here who has just been, well, beguiled once again by these incredible minute details that these early Northern Renaissance artists were able to capture, because I find them just amazing every time I look at them. So thank you again for spending your evening with me, and I welcome any questions or comments that people have about sacred symbols and devilish details. And I'll start looking through this chat. Let's see here. What museum has the unicorn tapestries? That is the Cloisters Museum. That's in the northern part of Manhattan. It's part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it is accessible, which is really cool. Can I speak to the use of symmetry in this school of art? Well, I've only sort of developed a new appreciation of that as I was putting these images into the PowerPoint slides, because you can really see how they were using grids and how putting things on an axis or on right down the middle essentially creating a symmetrical composition had a new meaning. I'm not sure if it was the be all end all for a lot of these artists, but certainly Durer's self-portrait is intended to be very symmetrical. I could go back through all of these probably, but it does seem to play an important role. And it's kind of fun to think about how they just put these pictures together in general, but symmetry certainly played a role. Why did they start using oil in the North? Did they not use it in Italy at all? Isn't the Mona Lisa oil, or is that later? Okay, so really good questions. It's interesting because Jan Van Ike's influence in this area has been completely overblown. And there was even Vasari, who was writing about the lives of artists in the 1500s, I think, and he wrote that Jan Van Ike actually invented oil painting. He did not do that. It's an overstatement, but he did invent some like binding pigments that kind of help it along. If I'm remembering correctly, I don't know offhand if the Mona Lisa is an oil painting. It probably is. I believe it's on a board. But Da Vinci was always experimenting with his materials. So there might have been other pigments and other chemicals that he might have included. So that's interesting to know. So oil painting did exist before this, but basically it came into its own during this time period, and people weren't painting on this scale really before this. It was, you know, small book illustration, essentially manuscript illumination. So that's why I think the chemistry around this sort of advanced during this time period, and that's why somebody might think that Jan Van Ike invented oil painting. And then there were some artists that crossed the Alps and traveled back and forth. So there was a little bit of cross-pollination. But when we think of the Italian Renaissance, I mean, for the most part, it's fresco painting. They're painting these huge monumental paintings in wet plaster. So so that's not to say that they never used oils, but it was a very different focus. Yeah. I see the comment here, Bosch is very creepy, and I would completely agree with that, Rosamond. Let's see. Well, I'm glad people enjoyed this. It's a lot of fun to zero in on these details. Devil is blue. Does symbolism carry across faiths, countries, and climates? That's a really interesting question. There's a pretty good documentary. It's only about an hour, and I believe it's on Amazon Prime, and I think it's called How the Devil Got Its Horns, and it sort of gets into some of the details around this, and it gets into a little bit of cross-cultural pollination as it relates to your question, Elaine, which is a really good question. I don't know for certain offhand, but I think you could get some more answers around that issue from that documentary. But it's a fascinating question in general. And just sort of thinking about the symbolism, the imagery, the visuals related to the devil, who seems so important as we think about religion, and just that the iconography related with the devil was never really nailed down. It's sort of up to the artist to imagine how bad it gets. In the goldsmith painting, what is all the stuff behind his shoulder? Edith, that's a really good question. Let's see, just a moment. I just wanted to go through some of these other ones just to see if we'll go back through them. The mousetrap seems to be floating over the street. Yes, that is a very funny perspective. And art historians have pointed this out too. It doesn't really seem to work. It almost looks like he's on a second floor, going back to the Merode Altarpiece. There's so much in this lecture. I know I wish I could have spent more time on this too. And how can people see these details? They really couldn't see the details of stained glass either. Is it just a private audience? Laura, that is a fascinating question. That's a really fascinating question. Who are these details really for, right? And how was the message really disseminated? That's a question for the ages. There's some really important works of art, even from the classical world, that were actually, I mean, it's completely inaccessible. So it's a really interesting question, and probably a different answer depending on which works of art that you're looking at. But I think it's good that you're prompting us to even think about that too. All right, so back to Edith's question about the goldsmith painting, all the stuff behind his shoulder. Let's see here. Petrus Christus over here. So we've got some vessels, we've got some beads. This almost looks like coral over here. I think these are like gemstones and some rings. I think it's mostly related to jewelry for the most part, but I don't know the exact specifics. I hope some of you noticed the convex mirror over here and how we see that in the Van Eyck as well. It's like a great art history 101 comparison for the final exam. I think I got to most of these.
Yeah, I think you did too, Jane. Thank you so much. you reminded me of, yes, an art appreciation class that I took I went to a Catholic university, and we did a lot of the triptychs and we went to the exhibits in the museum of the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really fascinating, all of the symbolism. It's great. And
Yeah.
I really appreciate you walking us through it. Thank you so much.
It's absolutely my pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. If no one else has any more questions. All right. Looks like we're getting some thank yous. So thank you, Jane.
Always
We
a
will let
pleasure.
you go.
Thank you.
And we will hopefully be able to nail down a date for January, but please check the calendar of the library and please sign up for our newsletter and you will definitely know what's next.
Yeah. Well, the next topic we do know. And
Paul Gauguin in Tahiti
yes,
is the next one. So please check the calendar and I will put that on tomorrow as soon as I get to work. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Have a
Good
great
night.
night. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Bye.